We're now going to talk about research design, and by design we're also going to talk about some of the problems and validity problems that come up. Sort of in a perfect world, the gold standard, so to speak, or that many people thought was the experimental design. And in that you have random samples. So if you're a whole population, everybody has an equal chance of being selected, and you randomly generate numbers, and that many people get selected. If you want 20 people, then if there's 40 people in a room, randomly you get the numbers, and then you pick those people who correspond with the numbers, and they end up in the group. From that group of 20 people, then you would randomly assign them to a controller intervention group. And again, another random, so that there's less things like selection bias, so people can't decide if they want to go into one group or another, those kinds of things. The problem is in the real world, you can't really do that. In a lot of the research that we do, we can't really do that. We can't exclude patients from receiving treatments, right? So they have to have sort of the gold standard versus an additional type of medication. We can't exclude people from, if we're going to measure the impact of a pregnancy prevention program and we know it's effective, we can't not deliver it to people for whom they're in a category of high risk. So again, in healthcare, we can't really always exclude people. We can't randomly select people. Another thing, and we'll talk about this when you talk about ethics, even with this sort of random sample and random assignment to groups, there is a problem because everyone has to give consent. And if people have to give consent or they want to drop out, which again are validity problems we'll talk about in a little bit, even in experimental design, these can cause validity issues, especially internal validity issues. And because people are allowed to drop out if they want, and people have to understand the risks and benefits, you may have a selection bias because I don't want to be in a group where I may not get the best medicine, and I don't want to be in the group where I get the placebo and not know about it, especially if you're really sick or if you are not unhappy with the treatment you're getting. So again, please keep in mind, even when you do an experimental design, it's still going to have validity problems. What most of us do when we look at evidence-based interventions or we look at programs or policies is we sort of have a quasi-experimental design, right? So we have not random sample or we don't have a random assignment, right? So we have one or the other possibly, but we can't necessarily have both. So if we're going to look at people who are homeless and are getting care from some organization like the Nice Ministry, and we're going to measure the impact of that care, does that give them the medical care that they need? Does it give them access to things that they need that attend to their medical issues? We're not going to get a random sample of people. We're going to get people who happen to be out on the streets those nights, and we're not going to be able to assign them to you get medical treatment and you don't, because they are a high needs population and they have to get medical access to care, and this may be the only way they can. So we're not going to have one or the other, right? But we do want to give them medical care because that's the ethical thing to do. The problem is that the further away we get from that experimental design, so-called, we have what's called validity issues. Now let's talk about validity. The first and most important kind of validity is called internal validity. And what it's concerned with is, are we drawing the right inferences from our study? Now, I'll give you lots of examples of this, but there are specific threats that you're going to have almost every time to internal validity. And you sort of have to check your research and say, do I have these threats? And what can I do to try to address these threats? Now, the first thing is that you want to make sure that you're not measuring the wrong thing, and that's not operational validity. That will come later. The first threat to internal validity, and again, internal validity is, am I drawing the right inferences from my study, is that you may look at an event and you may think that there was a change, but the real change was something happened in history. So, for instance, if I was looking at, do people support increasing taxes? And if I looked in New York City had a primary, and I looked, and before the primary, people did not support increasing taxes for police, fire, a wide range of public services. So then after the primary, when the candidates are on the stump and doing whatever, suddenly I see that there's huge support for that, and that they pass those measures are on the ballot, and those measures and the candidates that are attached to them, they win. So can I say that the public necessarily changed their mind based on the politicians making it important? Or do I have to look at what time that was happening and say maybe there was an event? And this is exactly what happened, and the event was 9/11. So before 9/11 happened in September, nobody really wanted to increase the taxes for public safety officials. After it, they did. But if I was measuring the impact of the public officials or on the ballot, I would have to say that there was a historical impact that could have explained what happened, not the politicians. Okay, so it's a significant history impact. If you looked at, oh, suddenly everyone's covered, and it was before or after the Affordable Care Act, you have to make sure that you're measuring and making sure that that is not a threat, so you're not just measuring the wrong outcome because of a historical event. Another thing is maturation. So sometimes people mature, and things would happen naturally whether you did the intervention or not. So let's go back to pregnancy prevention program. People as they get older are less likely to engage in high-risk behaviors. So is it that they had great access to my pregnancy prevention program, which made them aware of these high-risk behaviors? Or was it something that would have happened when they were 17 or 16 years old anyway, even without this program? Again, you want to make sure that you are drawing the right inferences from the study, the intervention that you did. And you have to make sure that you're aware of these could be problems within your study. And again, what you do in the first part is you monitor them, you note them, but when you're doing your research design, you try to control for them, and we'll talk about that in another video on how to do that. The second one, and it's probably there in every single study, is what's called selection bias. And what that is, and you still again get it because of ethical issues and because people can self-select to take part in a study. But selection usually happens when we're doing the kind of research that you'll all be doing, is that only certain people would be included in a diabetes education program, or only certain people would be included in looking at the impact of an intervention on getting people to do more compliance with their medication. Probably only people who are really non-compliant, or people who are hospitalized a lot for not taking their medicines. So that's a really select group, and that does impact things later, something we'll talk about a little bit later called external validity. So you've got a small group that you're looking at, and you're doing the intervention on them, maybe because they're the worst and they have the worst outcomes, right? So it makes sense to do the research because you want to do the most good with this research and this program and impact the people. One of the things too that you want to think about was when you're doing selection is that it might naturally occur, and that you have to sort of think about how it might impact who's involved in the study may determine the outcome. One of the things we've seen actually with selection is that when you look at drug studies, those little pamphlets that come with all your medications, the only people who are in those, and those are usually more experimental design, are the people who probably didn't drop out because they hated the drugs or they gave them bad side effects. And that's called mortality. So it's people who might drop out of the study. And again, because of ethics, you can't force people to stay in your study. But if certain people drop out, then the only people left may not be truly representative of the people in the phenomenon. So if you're doing an intervention in improving compliance, the people who might stay in the study are people who would have been more compliant to begin with. So that's a selection bias. So you might go, oh, the program worked, it's so great. What it really might have been is people who stayed in the program were the ones that were more likely with a little nudge to be compliant. The people who dropped out might be people who weren't going to be compliant, and they might be on the other end of the spectrum, but you don't know that. You can't force them to stay in. People are allowed to drop out at any time, and you can't quiz them extensively about why they dropped out. So you can get this kind of selection bias even if you have a great sample, especially when you have a small population that you're looking at doing an intervention. And it's something you need to be aware of and you need to speak to in your results. And again, we have some ways that we can sort of do interventions and try to control for that. I'll talk about that later. Another thing is testing. So if we give people a pre-test and a post-test, and you might have done this when you did a GRE, and the first time you took it, you didn't do so well, but then you figured out how the questions were asked and you remember the things you didn't know, and then the second time you took it, you improved. Did you get smarter? Maybe yes, maybe no, or maybe you understood how to do the test better. So we want to make sure with testing that it's not just we're really measuring people understanding how to game the test, and we're really measuring that people got smarter over a specific amount of time. This is always a problem when we're doing testing. Again, usually when you're testing knowledge, behavior, sometimes people know what they want you to do, you want them to do, and they will get better taking the test. Also, sometimes another thing, we usually call this the Hawthorne effect, is people will get better because you're watching them and you're taking a special interest in them. And that's one that's a little bit harder to control for, but it is something to keep in mind, especially since you are nurses. So you may not want to do an intervention, or you may not want to just do something with your own patient population because, oh, you really care and you're spending extra time with me, which you might have to do with patients, or you're giving me this special program. So then they sort of want to comply for you and they want to do better. And again, you're probably probably going to draw the wrong inferences. You're not going to draw whether or not this program would really work on patients. You're going to draw that people are reacting because you're paying special attention to them. It's always a problem. It's always something we have to think about. Another thing is instrumentation. So if you're asking people questions one way when they're doing the pretest for your program or you're evaluating diabetes intervention or compliance, you sort of have to ask at the end the same questions, because again, what you're measuring otherwise is just how people are answering the questions on the survey, not are they really understanding or are they really changing. So, and again, survey and instrumentation, they go together, right? So they both play into each other, making two validity issues. You want to use the same instrumentation and it be the same throughout the way you collect the data. You also want to make sure that you use the same, and that may mean that people understand and get better at the questions, right? Because you didn't change them up. You may have moved them around, but you still have to ask the same questions. Otherwise, you're really just testing the instrument, not testing the knowledge, the behavior, the things you think you're testing. Again, a lot of this stuff is sort of things you just sort of have to think about. There's no perfect research design, and you have to sort of accommodate them and make them better and come up with ways to address them if you can. The last thing is statistical regression, and that's when you're looking at patients that are way on one end or the other, and they may not see a lot of change, and it may not be because your program was good or bad. It just may be that they were way outliers, and they'd have to have a lot more of the program or a lot more of something. So again, you want to look at when you're just looking at outliers, you may have statistical regression, and you'd see that when you see results and when you did some stats. Another thing to think about, though, is that all of this sort of leads to external validity issues. And one of the external validity issues is, can I take my results and extrapolate them out to another patient population? And again, the more narrow and specific your patient population is, the more difficult that gets. Also, if you have a specific location where you're doing this, so patients who, like I talked about, homeless people who are getting their medical care through the Night Missions Medical Team, which is a volunteer group. That's a specific location, that's a specific patient population. It might have a specific history of people who get their medical care through that type of organization. So whatever results we'd find from any medical interventions we did there, or medical stuff we provided, may not be able to extrapolate out and talk about it with other homeless populations in other places. So they are difficult issues, but you do need to keep in mind, will you have these types of validities if you are doing these types of studies? And again, there's no perfect study, so it's very difficult, but I'll talk in the next video about some of the ways that we can try to see if that is or isn't the case, and ways that we can try to control for it or address it. And again, some of the readings for this week also talk to that and speak to that. But it's a difficult issue, and you do have to be aware of it and talk about it in your research proposal and your research design.